Atmosphere. Atmosphere is quite possibly the most important thing in any Animal Crossing game. Ever since the GameCube days, Animal Crossing has excelled in allowing the player to escape their own world and instead enter one of charm and relaxation, and that's all because of the specific atmosphere these games provide. The small town setting is hardly one that's exclusive to Animal Crossing, but the thing that truly sets these games apart from most others are their real-time clock and soundtrack. These two features work in tandem to create an experience that is unmatched by any other life simulator when they're perfected, and in my eyes, they were never more perfect than in 2013's Animal Crossing New Leaf. I'm hardly the first person to praise this game's music, and I absolutely won't be the last. It's easy to say that New Leaf's soundtrack is amazing because it simply sounds the best, but saying that doesn't acknowledge the incredible feats of this game's music and why I believe it surpasses the other Animal Crossing games' OSTs. So instead, I want to take an in-depth look at New Leaf's hourly soundtrack to explain why I believe it captures the essence of Animal Crossing perfectly, and hasn't been matched by any of the games preceding or following it. The first thing to talk about in regards to New Leaf's soundtrack is the instrumentation chosen, because it's such a crucial part in setting the right atmosphere. And while Wild World and City Folk's accordion-heavy music is much more iconic than New Leaf's music, Animal Crossing's 3DS outing still does a better job of capturing what the series is all about through its choice of instruments and when to properly use them. From the moment you boot up the game, the main theme lets you know that the piano is going to have a very prevalent role in New Leaf's soundtrack, which is genius because of how the instrument immediately fills the player with a sense of calm. One of my main issues with New Horizons' soundtrack is that a lot of the music, as well as the instruments chosen in general, clash very strongly against what I picture an Animal Crossing experience to be. New Leaf is almost completely opposite to it in this regard. Where New Horizons is loud, energetic, and rambunctious, New Leaf is calm, laid back, and relaxing. It's exactly the kind of music I would want during a peaceful day in a small town. The soft, unobtrusive nature of New Leaf's soundtrack also means that it's never distracting, which is a problem I commonly have with both New Horizons and the original Animal Crossing game. In New Leaf, the themes sort of just blend into the background when you're doing your own thing, which fits so well with the nature of Animal Crossing. Instead of having music blaring while you're digging up fossils and catching bugs, it simply feels like you're being accompanied by a timid yet beautiful collection of tunes as you progress throughout the day. And speaking of progression, that's something else that New Leaf's soundtrack absolutely perfects. It shouldn't be overstated how difficult it is to create 24 different music tracks and have them all feel connected while still having each sound distinct. And on top of that, making all of them good. Doing so is an incredibly complex, almost contradictory sounding task, which is why I don't hate any Animal Crossing soundtrack, despite thinking some are weaker than others. But somehow, miraculously, New Leaf pulled it off. I mean, Wild World and City Folk pretty much did it too, but I'll talk about that later. New Leaf's hourly music feels like a story that follows you throughout the day. With each passing hour, the story progresses in a new direction while simultaneously not entirely losing what had come before. This gives the entire soundtrack an incredible sense of cohesion, because each hourly track feels amazingly composed not only with that specific hour in mind, but also with how it will fit into the rest of the story. Let's look at a few of the game's morning tracks, for example. Listen to 6 AM. It sounds tired, underwhelming, like you're just getting out of bed. The notes are almost haphazardly played, with lots of space in between, truly capturing that early morning feel. But then you move on to 7 AM, and things are starting to get a little more lively. You're getting into your routine, the sun is rising, the day is off to a slow but decently productive start. And then you get to 8 AM, and the day is in full swing. The world is up, and everything's getting into motion. This is just a tiny example of New Leaf's incredible feat of cohesion in its soundtrack, which allows the music to progress throughout the day in a way identical to the player. But I know some of you are typing, Protendo, isn't that what every Animal Crossing game does? Isn't that literally the purpose of hourly music? And yes and no. Aside from Animal Crossing GameCube, which I find to be all over the place, it can be said that each Animal Crossing game at least tried to achieve this level of progression and connection in its music. But New Leaf is the only one to perfect the concept. New Horizons didn't do well in this regard. Like I said, the soundtrack is hardly terrible. There's a lot of music in it that I love. But it does not do a good job of portraying the feeling of specific hours through its music, aside from a few exceptions, and does an even worse job of stringing those tracks together in a cohesive way. City Folk, on the other hand, came extremely close to perfecting this on the same level as New Leaf, but in my opinion has a few pieces that ruin the flow of the soundtrack and feel a little unfitting. Like, in New Leaf, I can't find a single track that doesn't perfectly fit the hour it plays within, even if I'm not the biggest fan of a certain piece. This is what 3 PM sounds like. I often hear people refer to New Leaf's soundtrack as dull, and while everyone's of course entitled to their opinions, I just can't see it. Despite every track in New Leaf feeling like an evolution of what came before, each one of them is still incredibly distinct and memorable. Last New Horizons bashing moment, I swear, but listen to 9 PM and 10 PM from that game. One could argue that they're cohesive, they naturally flow into each other, and they'd be right. But do you know what else they are? Boring, dull, these tracks feel entirely forgettable and don't have an identity to call their own. But listen to 6 PM and 7 PM from New Leaf. One is clearly a setup for the other, yet they're incredibly different. New Leaf's entire soundtrack is like this, constantly setting up for future songs while ensuring they'll be different enough to stand out on their own. In my eyes, or I guess ears, New Leaf's music is the epitome of less is more. It doesn't need to go all to convey energy, and instead does so in a way that still fits the world that's being displayed. It doesn't need to become overly obnoxious to convey drowsiness, but still succeeds in doing so without jeopardizing the rest of the game's vibe. And it's in this less is more philosophy that New Leaf is able to give us the most touching, beautiful, and emotional pieces of music in the entire series. It just feels like this game understands. It understands what Animal Crossing is and how to properly convey that through its soundtrack. It understands that subtlety is a virtue and one that can actually strengthen the music, not weaken it. It understands the importance of a soundtrack that progresses alongside the player and evolves naturally throughout the day. This game gets it, and I'm still shocked that this masterpiece of a soundtrack was able to be created. Alright, fine, City Folk also succeeds in most of the areas I listed, but I wanted to talk about New Leaf, okay?